Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Huffman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Square One project at Columbia University Justice Lab. Square One is a multi-year commitment of Columbia University Justice Lab focused on conducting a foundational reevaluation of justice policy in this country, moving toward expanding opportunity, improving true public safety in local communities, and reducing reliance on punishment as a response to social problems that are so often rooted in poverty, violence, and racism. Since our inception in 2018, Square One has been committed to generating big ideas and focusing on the future, and today is no exception as we join Vinnie Schiraldi in talking about his new paper from the Square One Project's executive session on the future of justice policy. Can we eliminate youth prison, and what should we replace it with? It's my pleasure to welcome Vinnie and our panelists for this discussion today. I'll briefly introduce all of them and then hand it over to Vinnie to talk with us about his paper. Vinnie Schiraldi is a senior research scientist at the Columbia School of Social Work and is the co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab. Vinnie has worked for many years in the fields of juvenile and adult justice, founding the policy think tank, the Justice Policy Institute, and then moving to government as director of juvenile corrections in Washington, D.C., as commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation, and then senior policy advisor to the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. In all of these roles, Vinnie has had a reputation as a fearless reformer who pioneered efforts at community-based alternatives to incarceration in all of these settings. We're also joined by Ali, who is an Ethiopian-American social activist living in Portland, Maine. Ali is a youth organizer with Maine Youth Justice, an organization that brings together people of all backgrounds to address the failures of the criminal and juvenile justice systems while working to advance reform. He also works in partnership with the Young People's Caucus and with the Opportunity Scholars at the University of Southern Maine, which creates a bridge for formerly incarcerated young people to access post-secondary education. As a formerly incarcerated young person, Ali works tirelessly as an activist and organizer on behalf of Maine's most vulnerable populations. Next, we're joined by Seema Gajwani. Seema is the Special Counsel for Juvenile Justice Reform and Chief of the Restorative Justice Program section at the DC Office of the Attorney General, where she oversees juvenile justice reform initiatives focusing on restorative justice, diversion, trauma services, and improved data collection and analysis. Prior to this position, Seema ran the Criminal Justice Program at the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, D.C., and she started her career as a trial attorney in the D.C. Public Defender Service, where she represented both juvenile and adult clients. Finally, we're joined by the amazing Vivian Nixon. Vivian is the Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, an organization committed to removing individual and structural barriers to higher education for women with criminal histories and their families. Vivian spent time as a peer educator for the Adult Basic Education Program at Albion State Correctional Facility in New York, and following her release, she was ordained by the AME Church and currently serves as an associate minister at Mount Zion AME Church in New York City. She's a co-founder of the Education from the Inside Out Coalition, a collaborative effort to increase access to higher education for justice-involved students, and she chairs the board of directors of Just Leadership USA. And finally, we're joined by Judge Greg Davis. Judge Davis is joining us from New Zealand, where it's tomorrow, actually. Judge Davis was appointed to the District Court bench in New Zealand in June of 2010, and in that position, he oversees criminal and youth jurisdictions. He also presides over the Matariki Court, which deals with predominantly Maori offenders. It focuses on post-guilty pleas, but pre-sentence, offender-specific rehabilitation programs. These programs are designed to address the underlying causes of a person's presentation in the justice system. He also presides over the Rangatahi Court, a specialist court for young offenders that sits on Morai rather than a traditional court environment. And we'll hear more about that from Judge Davis. We're really grateful to all of our panelists for joining us today and to all of you who are joining us listening in, and look forward to a really exciting discussion. We're going to start with Vinnie, who will give us a bit of an overview of his new paper, and then we'll take the conversation from there. Vinnie?
Hi, thank you, Catherine, for that, and I'm honored to be part of today's Columbia Justice Lab Square One event, and to be on this panel with the esteemed co-panelists I'm on with, to discuss the elimination of the youth prison and the implications that has for criminal legal system and juvenile legal system reform efforts. There's plenty of acknowledgments in the paper itself, but I want to give a particular shout out to Evie Lapou, Anamika Dvivetti, Alex Schneider, and Madison Dawkins for helping research, edit, and lay out the paper and the presentation you're about to see. I never could have imagined when I started writing the paper that we'd be enmeshed in justified civil unrest over the killings of Black people at the hands of police that hold the potential not only to reform policing, but also to usher in reforms for youth and criminal legal systems. I hope we don't waste this moment on trivial incremental reforms, but try to get back to, as they say, square one, and that this paper offers some lessons from youth justice reform efforts to dismantle the youth prison as we endeavor to do so. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to speed talk you through the depths of where we were during the super predator era, then discuss the case against youth prisons in terms of their destructive outcomes, stark racial disparities, and endemic abuses. Then I'll discuss some of the factors that contributed to the dramatic turnabout that I'm going to talk about since the advent of the 21st century, and then talk about implications. Next slide. As you can see from these awful quotes, youth justice in the 80s and 90s was really awful. And I lived through it all. This is my 40th year in this. And it was truly a miserable thing to go through as an advocate, even worse if you were a parent or a kid caught up in the system. People like John DiIulio from Princeton and James Allen Fox from Northeastern were issuing weekly wild, and as it turned out, wildly inaccurate forecasts about a rising tide of juvenile super predators that was going to engulf America. These were cast in thinly veiled and sometimes not veiled at all racial animus. And people who engaged in it were rewarded with media, legislative victories, electoral victories, and John DiIulio himself became America's first faith czar, headed up the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, after he wrote that all that's left of the Black community in some pockets of urban America is deviant, delinquent, and criminal adults surrounded by severely abused and neglected children, virtually all of whom were born out of wedlock. This had an impact. This is not just trivial language. One poll in California showed 60% of respondents thought that kids commit most crime nowadays, when kids were committing about 13% of violent crime in California, and it found its way into policy as well. During the 1990s, every state toughened laws. We went to over 100,000 kids in locked custody. 250,000 kids were tried in America's adult courts. 17,000 of them were locked up in adult jails and prisons. This was unprecedented by US and international standards, and we were openly discussing whether this was bringing about the demise of the juvenile court. And I say this because many of you who haven't worked significantly in youth justice might think that what I'm about to say next was easy and doesn't have much relevance for the adult system because, you know, they're kids and people like kids. But it was hardly easy when you look at that history. We can go to the next slide. And then it stopped. So after this crazy increase and vilification of kids, there was a turnabout. Now, it didn't stop completely, but things got way better. We still have way more kids per capita in custody than other nations. There's plenty of work to be done to close youth prisons, and anti-Black racism still dominates our approach to youth justice. But while there is plenty of work to be done, you can see from this next slide that three things. One is that youth incarceration has plummeted. Two, that it hasn't been a jailbreak and has not negatively affected public safety. And three, that mass incarceration for young people has followed a very different path than it has for adults. So there's been a 2/3 drop almost in youth incarceration from its peak. Every state other than West Virginia has experienced double-digit declines during this time. 2/3 of the large facilities holding over 200 kids have closed since 1999, and kids did not shift into the adult system. There's been a 70% decline of kids locked up in adult jails and prisons in America. And meanwhile, although adult crime has declined at a more tepid pace since 2000, adult incarceration rose during that period. It's come down slightly since then, but nothing like what we're seeing for juveniles. Let's go to the next slide. So in these next several slides, I'm going to discuss some of the outcomes of the youth justice system and youth prisons for young people. Remember now, youth justice is unlike the adult system. There's two primary goals, really reducing the odds of young people reoffending and setting them on a path to successful adulthood. The focal point, in my view, in the case against youth prisons, that it fails at those two basic goals. While there's no single recidivism rate for states across the country, state-by-state data reveal that 70 to 80% of incarcerated young people are rearrested within 2 to 3 years of release. And when you look at more sophisticated research that compares similarly situated kids, you see that those similarly situated kids who are incarcerated do worse in terms of rearrests, in reincarceration, educational outcomes, employment outcomes, and mental health outcomes. Next slide. As I said earlier, the racial disparities in the youth justice system are stunning, just like they are in many respects in the adult system and in policing. Next slide. Black youth are locked up at nearly 5 times the rate of white youth in America, Native American youth at 3 times the white rate, and Latinx youth at nearly twice the white rate. As incarcerated populations have dropped by 2/3, these disparities have grown. There's strong evidence in the research of systemic disparities. 2/3 of the sophisticated studies show what researchers call race effects, disparities that are not accounted for by legal system factors at one or more stages of the youth justice processing system. And you can see from this chart that those disparities worsen as kids go deeper and deeper into the system. New York City now has reduced the number of kids in locked custody down from 1,800 to around 100 now. They're not even in locked custody now. There's only about 13 in locked custody. But every single kid in custody in New York City is Black or Latinx. And when I ran DC's youth correction system, I didn't have one white kid committed to my custody in the 5 years I ran that system. Next slide. And the youth system is subject to endemic abuse. Go to the next slide. One thing that always struck me as an advocate and when I ran youth corrections is that too often when abuses are uncovered and there's a scandal, the public and policymakers focus on this staff member or that administrator or that mayor or governor. But the youth justice movement has done a very good job, in my view, of making deliberate efforts to recast the problem, not as idiosyncratic, but as endemic, just like we're now seeing with efforts to change policing. We're talking about systemic racism, not individuals. The map created here is by the Casey Foundation. It shows documented cases of abuse and excessive use of restraints and isolation in the vast majority of states. The last time the Justice Department surveyed kids in custody, 1 out of 14 of them said they had been sexually assaulted within the last year. Imagine if that was the number for the high school that your kids attended or that you attended. Next slide. When I ran the DC juvenile justice system, what I inherited was a nightmare of sexual and physical abuse and just generally deplorable conditions. Elie Wiesel was right when he wrote that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy or neglect. The kids told us that they used to, for example, take their shirts off at night to stuff them into cracks in the wall to keep rats and cockroaches from crawling on them at night. Now, this is a system in our nation's capital that was under 19-year consent decree overseen by some of the best litigators in the country. These conditions are endemic, not idiosyncratic. We'll go to the next slide. So why did things begin to turn themselves around? What happened? Go on to the next slide. Well, some of the things I just talked about, first of all, just take a look at this slide, right? This just shows how elementally low the numbers have gotten in some places. California's youth authority, now called the Division of Juvenile Justice, used to have 10,000 kids in brutal locked prisons, and it's down to 700, and Governor Newsom's just proposed this year to completely close it. New York City, as I said, used to send 1,800 kids to our state youth prison system. We now have 100 in custody, most of them in group home-like settings, and 13 of them are in a locked, or actually 4 different locked facilities. So very small, very close to their families' homes. So how did we get here? Well, I mentioned some factors earlier: high costs, disappointing outcomes, stark racial disparities, abusive conditions, systemic examples of decarceration and plunging youth crimes. But some others include that there was a sophisticated advocacy done by an amazing group of local and national advocates and litigators that has involved youth and families and refused to run away from the humanity of the kids and their families and towards an exclusively technocratic argument. Mistakes I believe we made initially in the adult advocacy efforts to reduce incarceration. And I can't wait to hear Vivian's take on the importance of hearing from directly impacted people in such reform efforts. Long-term commitments by philanthropy to fund advocacy, to fund research, experimental policy, and practice approaches by foundations like the Casey, MacArthur, and Public Welfare Foundations, and more recently the Balmer Group, deserve a shout out, as well as a bunch of local foundations that have funded efforts like that in their own home states. Research that showed that both that kids are different than adults and that youth incarceration was a failure, and that there were programs that moved the dial on recidivism and other factors better than incarceration. And then open-minded policymakers and department heads enacted legislation and used their administrative powers to help reduce institutional populations. Now there's a group called the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice that I'm on, and that's located within the Justice Lab, that is a collection of youth administrators calling for the end to the youth prison. Next slide. And finally, implications. So go ahead to the next one. First, we should finish the job of closing youth prisons, in part because of all these destructive elements I mentioned earlier, but secondly, because when they remain open with even a few kids left in them, they consume exorbitant resources that could be used to help kids when they come home from the community. And I know Ali will talk about efforts in Maine that him and his colleagues are engaged in to close that remaining youth prison and recast the money, realign the money to help kids when they come home. Second, we need to capture those resources and not let them get sucked up by other government purposes. To paraphrase my colleague Bruce Western, so that when we take away the thin kind of safety provided by youth incarceration, we replace it with a thicker brand of safety that comes from turning kids' lives around. Seema from Washington, D.C.'s Attorney General Office can talk more about her experience providing those kinds of supports while diverting kids from incarceration. And finally, something both adult and youth prison reforms have not done well has been to truly invest in communities and co-design solutions with the very people most impacted by mass incarceration. I offer several examples of burgeoning efforts to do that in the paper, and Judge Davis from the Rangatahi Court in northern New Zealand can talk about his tribe's successful efforts to reimagine justice there. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to Catherine now.
Great. Thank you so much, Vinnie. That was a terrific overview, covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time. And I'm really pleased that we're going to be now turning to Ali, who will join us to talk a little bit about his work. Something that Vinnie was just referencing was that there's a role for everyone in this work, and that it's really crucial to have the communities very closely involved in advocacy and also in the provision of justice. So we're excited to hear from you a little bit about your work in Maine and the work of you and your colleagues. Tell us about the youth-led advocacy efforts there and how that's changed the landscape for juvenile justice reform.
Well, to kind of give you the outlook on everything, I would kind of have to give you a little bit of background of being incarcerated in the first place here in South Portland. I was incarcerated in Long Creek for 18 months as a juvenile, and then I got out at the age of 19. But during my time of incarceration, there was like theater programs that we were in, where we were telling our story out into the public, and we would go off grounds to the main college over here, the USM college, and over 500 to 600 people were in audience at the time, and they were just listening to our stories, and they were surprised by the kids that were up there doing these performances. They were like, this is not what I expected when I saw these kids. But eventually, so after I got out, I continued the work with Maine Inside Out to do more performances all over. And eventually what happened was the performances, as it continued after 6 or 7 years, people were starting to question more of like, why are we harming the youth that are already harmed throughout their lives already? Like, we have to deal with the trauma that we had when we were younger, but now we had to deal with this other trauma that you have when you're locked up and confined in a space. And it took about the same 18 months of being locked up to have another 18 months of being out just to recover. So going through this whole recovery process and trying to still express the issues that we were dealing with out into the community, out into the schools and everything in the area, people started looking at it like what's going on, not only with the system, but why are you apologizing? And that's the exact question that I started asking myself and everybody else. Like, why are we apologizing if we're put into these circumstances that made us, make the decision? So over time, we started looking at it like, maybe we need to look at a different way of dealing with youth that are being harmed. So we created this this branch that came out of Maine Inside Out called Maine Youth Justice. The Youth Justice became the campaign itself. Back when I was locked up, it was about 250 to 300 kids that were in there. Now we have about 20 to maybe 40 kids left. And there's been a lot of efforts with the campaign itself to push for the closure of Long Creek and the $18 million that stuck to the building to get reinvested back into the communities that are being affected the most. One of the biggest things that, like in Maine, we have 1.6% percentage of Black people in total, but there's 23% of Black youth that are incarcerated. So that right there had really, we kept pushing for that. And when this the Black Lives Matter, the expression of the Black Lives Matter, everything just broke out the past month or two. Everybody was like, okay, so we need to focus on what's going on with the Black Lives Matter. And that also focuses on mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, this is our realm. So everybody started to listen to us with all the work that we've been doing for the past 7 or 8 years. And also being part of all these different organizations. Only a campaign cannot pressure. It can cause pressure, but you have to do a lot of other things to really close down a facility, because it's not only a facility, it's the money that's stuck to it, it's the employees that are there, it's the laws, it's the charges, it's all this whole realm of systems that was created after all these other punitive systems. So what I had to do was I started to work with USM. It was a university at the Law and Policy Center. To create this. So they made a decision to work with the Department of Corrections and the community itself to get the kids out, and to have the community build the programs that the youth need, so they could get out, because some of the kids were still homeless, some of them didn't have jobs, they needed skills and whatnot. So you have to work with the community. And as I started working with them, became the youth voice on there. And also I started working with Young People Caucus, which is another branch off of the USM that would talk to legislators about the issues within the community. So right now we have about 6 staff and about 14 youth steering committee members that are, some of them are life experience, some of are just they know of friends that are incarcerated, but you need a team of everyone. You need everyone to give it from their expertise and whatnot. The photos up here where this was just a week and a half ago. I got a phone call from a few legislators and a few decision makers to come talk to the city councilors and the mayor and all that, and the city manager, to speak about the issues and try to see what's going on with the protest itself. And it was about 2,000 to 3,000 people, and I'm like, you can't respond to 2,000 to 3,000 people and try to water down a protest. People are responding from their own oppression, and this isn't just a regular oppression that we can just identify with a chief of police or anything. This is oppression that's been happening for generations, and people are speaking out, even though Maine is 96-97% white. it was a majority of white people and a lot of Black people up there there to speak. So what I did was I decided to just like let the youth speak from their own voices, and a lot of the chief of police and everybody was just like really understand. You're like, whoa, like we didn't know that you guys were in these positions, and going back to the history of from slavery and going all the way into the redlining and drug infestation and the 100 years they would give for having crack cocaine compared to cocaine. And so just giving that information out, people were really surprised that day, and it opened up a lot of eyes, and we've been getting a lot more support in closing down the juvenile facility and reinvesting the money. And yeah, but if I've answered it.
Yes. Oh, Ali, that was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And it really is just such, it's such strong evidence for the importance of having young people involved, not just in coming up with what the solutions are and what the changes are that need to be made, but also in, creatively adapting to the ways in which you communicate that and the ways in which you, I hear you developing lots of different types of functions with the work that you're doing to make it all happen. It's really, really incredible. So thank you for sharing that. We'll be circling back for more conversation in just a few minutes. Following that, I'm going to turn us over to Seema, who's going to join us to bring us the perspective from the work that she's done within the government. We heard from Ali there about the work that's been happening externally and the pressures that are being brought to bear from the community. And in DC, over the past years, government leaders have played a role in bringing down the numbers so dramatically and keeping down the numbers of kids who were incarcerated, even as really low youth crime rates were continuing. How can government leaders play a role? How can they respond to this in a way that promotes public safety and keeps young people in their homes and communities?
Thank you. I'm so happy and honored to be here. Thanks, Catherine and Vinnie, for your vision and for this great report and for the amazing work you're doing, Ali. It's great to hear from you just now. Attorney General Racine was actually really looking forward to being a part of this event, but he had a family emergency, and so he couldn't be here and sends his regards. But I can talk a little bit about the work that he's done while in office in DC. The Office of the Attorney General is the exclusive prosecutor for all juvenile crime in the District of Columbia. And Attorney General Racine was elected in 2015, and he's a reformer. Attorney General Racine ran on a platform of juvenile justice reform. And we are lucky to be working in a city that was brilliantly led by Vinnie in its juvenile justice reforms years ago, when Vinnie helped shrink the juvenile justice system at the deep end of the system. And that work has continued since he's gone, with Clinton Lacey and others doing incredible work on the deep end. On the other hand, Attorney General Racine, as the prosecutor, as the elected prosecutor in DC, overseeing all juvenile crime, plays a really important role at the front end of the system. And when he came into office, he knew kind of early on that there was a cost to prosecuting youth. He knew that once a young person hit the juvenile justice system and penetrated through the system, that their lifetime outcomes would plummet, that they were more likely to be suspended from school, to be expelled from school, more likely to continue to have involvement in the justice system, both in the juvenile and the adult justice system. And as Vinnie talked about, lifetime outcomes in all other segments of their lives are statistically worse once they've penetrated into the juvenile justice system. They're less likely to get a job, less likely to get married, more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, engage in substance abuse. And so there was a recognition, even though he was the prosecutor of juvenile crime, that there was harm that prosecution caused. And he saw our office as the gatekeeper to the juvenile justice system and recognized that there was a really important role that he could play in keeping youth out. So when he came into office, DC at the time had a small, highly underutilized, but high quality diversion program that lived in our public health system, not in the criminal justice or juvenile justice system. The Department of Human Services had an evidence-based diversion program that utilized functional family therapy and had contracts with pro-social boxing gyms and recording studios and things in the community. But they were receiving and working with youth at a really small rate. When Attorney General Racine came into office, he increased the rate of diversion by the prosecutor's office by 6 times within the first few months of being in office. The program now, years later, has had over 2,300 youth complete it. Of the youth who've gone through the program, and these are youth who would otherwise be prosecuted in the District of Columbia, who are referred by OAG. Of those youth, 80% of them weren't arrested for a new crime within 2 years post completion of the diversion program. I remember when in one of the first budget cycles for the Office of the Attorney General, the Chief Deputy came back from a visit with the Attorney General to the City Council. And he'd gone from council member to talk about OAG's budget. And they had a long list of asks that they had for the Attorney General's budget for the office. And the Chief Deputy was so frustrated. And she said, I can't believe it. He went into all these council members' offices. We had all of these things to ask for. And what he asked for was more funding for the Department of Health to increase their diversion program so they could absorb more youth that we were going to divert, which just shows his commitment to doing what was right for youth in the city. After we started diverting youth at that rate, the numbers of kids who were in the system just went down tremendously. Actually, over the last few years, the number of juvenile court judges in the district went from 4 to 2 because there weren't enough cases for 4 full calendars for family court judges. Another thing that he's done in office is work closely with law enforcement and police to change the rules around youth engagement by law enforcement. And this has been in the works for about a year, but just recently, maybe in the last 6 months, went into effect and has had dramatic implications. But some of the things that we worked with them to do is to change rules about handcuffing and arresting youth, that police are prohibited now from handcuffing and arresting youth 12 years old and under, unless there's no danger of immediate harm. And for age 13 to 17-year-olds, there's a presumption against arrest. And in order to arrest, if there's not immediate danger, they need to seek supervisory approval first. And often they have to call our office. Interestingly, this theme of kind of reducing arrest authority among police is something that we are working with right now, as we are working on legislation around police reform in response to the protests and the brutality that's become more kind of acceptable. The response to the brutality, which has gone mainstream now, has created a moment for us, and we are trying to seize that moment and change the way that police are authorized to use arrest for misdemeanor offenses. The last thing I want to talk about is this other cohort of youth who kind of remained in our juvenile justice system after we diverted most of the low-level offenders and folks who are involved in the system for the first time. And that is youth who are committing serious and violent offenses, or youth who had multiple cycles through the juvenile justice system. And these are youth for whom the victims of the crime and community members want not just treatment, but they also want accountability. And to respond to that, and also to create another off-ramp for youth who have committed more serious crimes, who are being prosecuted, the Attorney General started the Office's Restorative Justice Program. And this program is exclusively for youth who are not diverted. It is an opportunity for the youth who are being prosecuted to have their case dismissed after successfully going through the Restorative Justice Program. Our office now has 6 full-time restorative justice facilitators on staff who handle these serious and violent crime cases. Given the population of the District of Columbia's youth in the justice system, all of our staff who are restorative justice facilitators are African American, many of whom have been justice involved themselves, or live or come from communities that have been over-criminalized historically in DC, which helps change the makeup of the staff at the Office of the Attorney General. The Restorative Justice Program has held over 130 restorative justice conferences successfully. About 7 of them, only 7 have been sent back for traditional prosecution. Over 90% of the victims and other participants who were involved in the restorative justice dialogues report being satisfied with the process and say they would recommend it to others in their similar situation. And of the youth who go through the restorative justice program, there are lower recidivism rates 1 year out compared to those who are similarly situated, who would be prosecuted. So there is quite a bit that government can do. Vinnie has had the great fortune and time to be on all sides of the system and work from the outside and the inside. But Attorney General Racine, I think, is a great example of someone who works through, law enforcement as an elected prosecutor to really be a visionary about reform.
Thank you, Seema. Thanks for sharing all of that. That's just some incredible stories, and really appreciate the specificity. It's so helpful to hear about the really broad range of ways that government actors can make change. It's about procedures such as not handcuffing and instead treating kids as kids. It's about the law and policy and changing the presumptions about arrest. And it's about the money and where it goes and moving it from one agency to a different agency and be willing to say, this is something that is better accomplished in another part of our system. That's really powerful examples, and we'll talk more about that and its relevance in this moment right now, in the time we have in a few minutes. It's now my pleasure to introduce Vivian Nixon, who is going to talk with us a little bit about her perspective as someone who's worked on issues related to young people as well as adults who are involved in the system. Vivian, tell us what you think about what's happening within the youth justice side of things and the way in which that's come to be. And also, what do you see as the lessons that we can learn from youth justice advocates that may have applicability in the work that we do to try to shrink and ultimately, hopefully, eliminate the adult justice system as it stands today?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to everyone who has presented so far. I confess that I am not here with any answers, but I am examining how we were able to drastically reduce the number of youth incarcerated and to recognize the humanity of this youth over time, and asking myself what allowed that to happen. One of the things that became really clear to me in the reading of Vinnie's paper is that the recommendations that ultimately came to be obvious were not really things that I believe every community would have to think that hard about. The recommendations were, and there's some nuance there that I think could be developed, but the first recommendation, limiting contact with antisocial peers and encouraging contact with pro-social peers. I think we have to be really careful about defining antisocial and pro-social. Some of the best advice I've ever gotten in my life has been from family members who would not be put in the category of pro-social peers. But also keeping youth proximate to their communities. Of course, everybody needs community. They need to be surrounded by people who love them, whether they are parents or other relatives or other forms of family that people create. And in some communities, that looks like a crime, unfortunately, because people are so desperate for community that they do form ways to have a bond and to have people that they know have their back and that will protect them. And we slap a gang label on it and call it something else. And it creates a hostile relationship between that bonded group and the law, and makes it almost impossible to negotiate a different way of behavior because of what we label it. Providing social context that has ample opportunity and structures for healthy development. Again, healthy development looks different in different communities, and certainly some communities have more resources than others to provide that. So it matters where resources go. And I've always been a proponent of opportunities for academic success, because the things that one learns and internalizes as part of the construct of personality will never go away. It's something that can't be taken from them. And that goes for young people and every other age as well. You know, it really got to me when Ali was describing the performances in the community and the surprise of the audiences. And you know, I saw him struggle for a minute, like trying to describe what that surprise was about. They're surprised about what? They were surprised about your humanity. And that's where I see a connection, that we imagined at some point in this process of over-incarceration to see youth as human, especially when we were able to expose the types of things that were happening at Oak Hill and in other places where kids were being severely abused. We imagined them to be human, and that it wasn't okay to let them to die in these horrible places. We have not really yet gotten to the place where we're not okay letting adults to die, especially if those adults are in Black bodies. We are letting people to die right now inside of COVID-infested facilities, people who are just weeks away from release, who have already spent decades in prison. We have to get to that place where it's not okay to let people to die, where we recognize their humanity, no matter what their neighborhood looked like when they grew up. One thing about adults that is true for every adult is that they were kids once. And so the same elements of compassion that we find for these kids, we should be able to find that level of compassion for the adults that used to be these kids, for the adults who grew up in less than ideal circumstances, that some people, often the people who are making decisions about the trajectory of young people, can't imagine. And so that they can't make decisions based on those circumstances because they're circumstances they can't even imagine. And those circumstances aren't always the blame of the parents, as Vinnie read earlier, those words of John Giglio coming from these deviant, delinquent, and criminal adult parents born out of wedlock, which I really, really struggle to find out why that makes a difference. But that was my amusement from reading that. Severely abused, as it's some universal thing that happens. I grew up in a housing project. The people who were severely abused were very few, and the community tried to intervene where that happened, mostly without involving the law, because we also knew the law was not there necessarily to protect us, as we are seeing more and more in our society. It's evident more and more in our society because of technology. But it's not too far in our past. It's not the 1990s when we heard similar language on the day of a presidential inauguration, when he described certain communities as being filled with mothers and children. Of course, no fathers. Fathers weren't mentioned. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, in rusted out factories, scattered tombstones. That's how people who come from certain backgrounds and who live the ideal life imagine many adults and children to live in this country. And also imagine that even in these communities filled with rusted out factories that are tombstones, that our education systems are flush with cash. These were the words spoken at an inauguration of an American president. So it is no wonder that we have not been able to find that level of compassion for adults, because this is who we imagine them to be. And for that, a bright light has to be shown, just like the bright light was shown on facilities like Oak Hill, that these are not horrible, inhuman people being placed separate from our society and being treated humanely, but they need to be separate from us to keep us safe. It is just the opposite. It is still inhumane to lock people up, to let them to die, even if they are adults. We need to view through a different cultural lens what it means to be worthy of health and safety. Does it depend on one's age? Does it depend on one's skin color? We have to come to grips with structural racism, because we know that those conditions aren't okay for everybody, whether they have broken the law or not. It was said so profoundly during the first night of the unrest after George Floyd's murder, that we learned this from you, from the brutality and the violence with which this nation came to being. And that first reaction, having some element of anger and violent response, not all coming from our community, but those techniques were taught to us because violence has been thrust upon us. What lessons do we learn from that? That we began to see beyond the skin color of young people. We began to see beyond their Blackness and see their humanity. When can we cross that threshold? That is the threshold of structural racism. Being able to easily and quickly dismiss the suffering of Black bodies as normal, as what we've always done in this society. And for that, it's going to require a huge shift, not just in who's responsible for allocating the resources, because resources are being allocated by people who imagine us in a certain way. But who are the resources going to? And who is designing, as Vinnie so eloquently said in the paper, who is co-designing or designing these programs designed to create healthy and safe communities? They also have to be in charge of where the resources are going and in charge of defining what a safe and healthy community looks like. And I'm going to end with this because it has been on my mind, and I think we need to rest in the unrest for a little while longer. There is a lot of energy around, okay, how do we fix this? What part of the problem do we fix? And how do we scale it up so that it's fixed everywhere? Well, Vinnie was really smart and said in his paper, it doesn't mean you make a cookie cutter approach and that you do it the same way everywhere, because everywhere is not the same. But there are some things that need fixing everywhere. And what needs to be fixed is what a parent sees when a Black child is born into this world, who will eventually become a Black adult. And I'll leave you with a short passage, which is where I think we stand in this moment. We stand in a place where we are unhopeful but not hopeless. And those are the words of W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903. When his child was born, this is partially his reaction. Within the veil he was born, said I, and there within shall he live, a Negro and a Negro's son, holding in that little head, bitterly, he unbowed pride of a hunted race, clinging with that tiny dimpled hand, wearily to a hope, not hopeless, but unhopeful, and seeing with those bright, wondering eyes that peer into my soul, a land whose freedom is to us a mockery and whose liberty is a lie. I saw the shadow of the veil as it passed over my baby. I saw the cold city towering above the blood-red land. I held my face beside his little cheek, showed him the star children and the twinkling lights as they began to flash, and stilled with an evening song the unvoiced terror of my life. To still the terror of Black lives in America, we've got to get to that same point when we look at a Black adult that we finally got to when we looked at a Black youth and say, this is a human life worth saving, and they should not be let to die.
Vivian, thank you for that. Thank you for that. You've brought us to the root of it, as you often do. We have to recognize the humanity of each person, child or adult, and to respond with the full compassion and refuse to let them to die, and to refuse to accept that normalization of death as structural racism teaches us to do all the time. Thank you very much. We're going to follow that that theme and that conversation with Judge Davis. Judge Davis, we're going to turn to you. Vivian alluded to the importance of recognizing humanity in every person, child or adult, of responding to the needs of young people to have community and connection. Ali referenced this also, the need to respond to young people in a totally different way. Judge, you've been working to make that possible in the courts that you work with in New Zealand. Tell us more about that. What has meaningful community co-design of responses for youth misbehavior looked like in your jurisdiction in New Zealand? And how do you involve the community not only in designing justice, but also in dispensing justice? Tell us about your experience there.
Tēnā koe, ko te kōrero tuatahi māku kei te mihi kia koutou. Kei te mihi kia koutou I tōku aku I reo, te reo take o te tai, o Aotearoa o te tai tokerau. Firstly, I want to just acknowledge you all in our native language, because that in itself is really the essence of how unresponsive the justice system has been to our Māori children in New Zealand. You may not know much about New Zealand, but New Zealand was a country that our people settled in about 1,100 years ago, and lived in continuous occupation of the country up until about 1769, where it was discovered, in inverted commas, by the British. We didn't actually realize it had been lost, but apparently it was discovered way back then. And over the years, through the process of colonization, the Western legal system has effectively gone and squashed all of our traditional indigenous legal systems that we had in place. And so what we've had over the years is the introduction of a very Western legal paradigm, which has resulted in a court system that you guys would recognize if you were to come over to New Zealand. And that included our youth, as we call it. I think you use the description, the juvenile jurisdictions. Now that resulted in incredible failures by the system. Māori make up about 16% of the population. It makes up, our people make up 50% of the male adult prison population, about 63% of the female adult prison population, and we make up about 66 to 70% of all juvenile or youth prosecutions. And they were being run through a Western court, if you like. In about 2008, it was decided by a judge down on the East Coast that things had to change. And he approached the local community and said, can we do this a better way? And to cut a very long story short, because there's lots of arguments about it, he ended up moving his juvenile court onto a marae. And you'll see some photos there next to my image. The marae is a traditional meeting place. And if you have a look in the bottom right-hand corner, that's what a meeting house looks like. On the top right-hand corner, you'll see a depiction of somebody holding in that case, an axe. That's an ancestor, Kupe. That ancestor discovered New Zealand when we found it in the first place 1,000 years ago. So our court sittings in the youth court, in some instances, don't sit in the traditional court. They sit in a forum and in a shape very much like what you have in the top left-hand corner. Now, what you have in that photo is sitting at the table, believe it or not, as a judge. In addition to that, there are elders from around the community. Somewhere in that photo is the prosecutor. I can't actually see him. I think he'll be on the left. That's traditionally where they are. But if you look at the right-hand corner of that table, right through around to the guy that's in the center, they are all elders of the community. And they sit with the judge and help to dispense justice. The person standing up there is the young person who is before the court. That young person, the court traditionally operates with lawyers saying lots, prosecutors saying lots, and judges saying even more. It was funny that the voice we heard the least from throughout an entire process was the young person. We flipped that on its head. The best procedures that we have, or the best processes that we have, are those in which our young people are front and center and are engaged in the process. The reason that this became so important was because we figured out along the way that substantive outcomes are improved if there are better procedural processes along the way and engagement by young people and that young person's community. We have a word in our language called whānau. It means family, but it doesn't just mean a nuclear family. It involves, it incorporates parents, uncles, aunties, cousins, grandparents, and so on. Unless a person is intimately connected to their whānau, and their whānau are involved in bringing up their child, then we are of the view that there is likely to be more interaction with the criminal justice system. What we have begun to understand more fully is that the pathway to the adult jail or the adult prisons is through state intervention, whether that is in a juvenile prison facility or state intervention generally. There's been a recent study completed that says something along the lines of 90% of all adults that are incarcerated have at some point been in the custody or the care of the state, whether that's as a result of youth offending or as a result of the need of placement by the state in some form of care and protection. So really the answer is here, more community involvement and less state involvement. And that is why we decided to try and get everybody out of, or get our young people as much as we were able, out of the courtroom, back into an environment that they would be, we hoped, more familiar with. Many of our young people have, by virtue of urbanization and colonization, lost the ability to speak our language, lost the general connections with the historical traditions. So bringing them back into this community environment is an opportunity for our young people to reconnect with their whānau, their family, the broader communities, to re-engage with the language, the traditions, and so on. And that, we believe, has a pronounced impact on how, or the likelihood of young people to be engaged in the criminal justice system, or not engaged, I think is really a better way to put it, as they move through their lives. So that was one of the initiatives that we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are 18 of these courts around the country, and that includes 2 that we've set up specifically for our Pacific brothers and sisters from around the Pacific Islands who have come to New Zealand in great numbers. So we have 18 in all, from the length, the top of the North Island where I live, right down to the sort of middle of the South Island, and they're scattered around the country. And we endeavour to get, in particular, our Māori and Pacific Island youths into this environment as much as we can. Up north, it's extended a wee bit further. We have, in addition to a rangatahi court, we actually have another program which is called the Mahuru program. Mahuru is a word in our language which means spring, and what it is an alternate to incarceration in a youth justice facility. The nearest youth justice facility from where I preside is about 2 to 3 hours away by car, depending on which court you're sitting in. And if a youth is remanded in custody in the very top of the North Island, it's about 3 or 4 hours away for that family to visit that youth. Our people said, hey, that's not good enough. If we have a young person that's placed in custody, they describe that as being almost akin to a treasonous act, not by the Crown, but our people. Treasonous to the extent that we have somehow failed our young person. So they said, we want to do this better. We do not want to have our young people in custody. And the Mahuru program was set up, which has intense community involvement. The young people live in residences in the community. There's additional security, but that's in the form of security cameras. There's no fences, no barbed wire fences, no razor wire fences. And they work with elders and other mentors within the community, but remain in the community, remain connected to their family, remain connected to their whānau as they move through the youth court process, with a view to getting them back into their family environment as quickly as that is possible. Sometimes, of course, that'll take a wee bit of time because you have issues within the family that need some work. But we are collectively of the view, I believe anyway, we're collectively of the view that most young people respond the best when they are back with their family. Doesn't matter what the issues are within the family. Most young people recognize this is mum and this is dad, and that's where I want to be, and they will not work, in our view, to address the underlying drivers of the offending while their mind is focused on getting back home. So we have to work with that and get our communities engaged with the whānau as much as we are able to do to facilitate. We think these, the general need to address the offending, to ensure the communities are safe. But there are different ways of doing it rather than sitting in a traditional environment, a court that is foreign to the young people and their family, where they're not engaged in the process, they're not asked to speak generally. And then at the end of the day, if we don't like what they're saying or doing, we throw them in jail or put some order over them, which restricts movement or something of that general nature. So that engaging the community to look at specific rehabilitative plans that address not only the underlying causes of the offending, but also the disconnection from culture, from language, from education, from family, and so on, is critical, in our view, to reducing the rate of recidivist offending, both as a youth and significantly in the adult jurisdiction. So those are some of the initiatives that we've got in the youth jurisdiction, but we've also got a similar concept going on in the adult jurisdiction in the north, where I sit as well. And it mirrors very much what we're doing in the youth court. But fundamentally, one of the big changes, the big psychological changes, was getting out of the court into an environment where our young people were more prepared to engage, and that was on the marae, as we call it, which is the traditional ancestral house. If we can go back to the first photo, please, Elizabeth, or the first set of photos. What you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner is a whole lot of red carvings. Now, those carvings have a particular cultural significance. They tell the story of the tribe. They often are depictions of ancestors, and it's a way of again reconnecting young people with those traditional stories. Now, this particular marae in the bottom right-hand corner is one that's been built in the city. It doesn't belong to a particular tribe. It belongs to all of the tribes, and it's attached to one of our universities. And there's a lot of important functions going there, both in terms of meeting of dignitaries, and that particular marae isn't actually used as a rangatahi court, but it was a good chance to show you a example of the marae. So the photo in the top left-hand corner is not the inside of the building in the bottom right-hand corner. So that's some of the stuff we're doing in New Zealand. And if any of you get a chance to come to New Zealand, Vinnie has, please come and have a look at what we're doing. We'd love to see you, and we'd love to share our ideas with you. Most importantly, we'd like to steal as many of your good ideas as we possibly can and import those into some of the things that we're doing in New Zealand. So I won't drag things out much more, other than to say thank you for the chance to speak with you all. Kia ora koutou.
Judge Davis, thank you so much for that. It's incredible to hear those stories and to see the images and have a sense of just how incredibly powerful that community-based response is. That's just incredible. We have had a great conversation, and we are fast running out of time, but we don't want to leave without giving our audience an opportunity to ask a couple of questions. So we're going to start with just a couple and wrap up soon, but we're just so thrilled that so many people have joined us for this discussion. Our first question comes from Aisha Sanchez. To what do the subject matter experts credit tipping the momentum? Was it the people-first approach of testimonials from the kids and families affected? Was there a #George Floyd-like moment? I think, Vinnie, why don't you take that question, if you don't mind?
Sure, I'll try to be quick. Mostly, if you use a baseball analogy, this is a lot of singles and doubles scored these runs, no grand slams, but occasionally there are horrible atrocities that get uncovered. In Texas, there was just disgusting sexual abuse of the kids in the facilities, and they passed legislation that resulted in a bunch of facilities being closed and money realigned to communities, a bunch of youth prisons being closed. In New York, Darrell Thompson, a 15-year-old Black youth from the Bronx, was killed in a takedown by staff. And that really spurred on a lot of Justice Department investigations, ACLU and Human Rights Watch reports, litigation. But there was also Gladys Carrion running the system, and she was herself very active and closed 26 facilities, and a very robust advocates who pushed for these reforms. So it's hard to, sort of pick any one thing. And again, I think the lesson for other reforms is it's both and. It's not just George Floyd. It's all the activism. It's all the policy work. It's all the ongoing efforts to get stuff done. So that's, I think, true to the youth justice system and will be true going forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll take the singles and doubles, although I think we'd all also be happy to take a few grand slams as well. That would be terrific. Let's go. I think we have one more question that we have time to take from our audience. From Davion Zeno. As the public continues to demand defunding of the police, what implications does this have for both juvenile prisons and adult prisons? That's a great question and very timely. And Ali, I think you have some thoughts on that. We'll turn to you.
Yeah. With the demand of defunding the police, this it's a powerful message. The reason why they're saying demand and defund and not reform, it's because this specific time everyone's going to be like, especially those in power are going to look at it like we need to reform, but we can't reform a system that was directed to first get you into a community that is struck in where your environment changes who you become, and then you get incarcerated. There is no fixing this system. We're not asking for a reform. We need a whole new system and how we put these kids in these better environments in the first place. So the demand and defunding the police is already the pressure, like it's to release the pressure. That's the first thing. And then reinvesting back into the communities in a positive way. It's the only way. There's no other way of trying to calm down the harm that you're putting against people. It's always healing.
Yeah, that's such a great way to put it, releasing the pressure and really needing to think foundationally about what needs to change. This has been just an incredible discussion, and I wish we had a lot more time to talk about the commonalities among the ways that things need to change, and also the very specific ways in which particular communities have needs and want to change. To hear more about what's happening in New Zealand and in Maine and in so many other places around the country, Washington, D.C. But I'll have to leave it there with a huge thank you to our panelists for your time this afternoon and for your incredibly thoughtful and insightful discussion. To Vinnie for this terrific paper and for really bringing us to this really crucial question of how can we take what we've learned and the ways in which we are seeing such a turnaround in the youth system and bring that to bear on the adult system in every possible way. It's incredibly powerful. And a huge thanks to all of the staff who helped us put this together, and to all of you who've joined us from your homes. This will be available on the Square One YouTube channel, and we hope you'll join us for the continued programming of our Justice is the Next Normal campaign and the many other events and papers that are going to be coming soon. Thanks to everyone, and have a great evening. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.